Hello and welcome. This third lecture video for Chapter 10 focuses on the units of production depreciation method and also the double declining depreciation method, okay? So we concluded the last lecture video by talking about the straight line depreciation method. Now the straight line is a pretty popular method, and it's useful for those types of assets that are used on a consistent basis across their useful lives. So, for example, a laptop. I have my laptop with Mary Washington. I use it pretty consistently each year. It's not like I use it a lot in 2016 and I barely used it in 2019. I use it pretty much the same every single year. So straight line depreciation makes sense for an asset like that. But what if we have an asset that is used a lot in year one of its useful life, barely at all in year two, maybe it's used some more in year three, and then not used in year four, and then used a whole lot in year five. So you do have some assets that vary in their use across their useful lives. Think maybe a truck on a construction site. Could be used a lot in the beginning, but not so much later on during the construction of the building or house or whatever, okay? So when you have those types of assets that are used in varying manners across their useful lives, a good depreciation method is units of production, okay? And that's what I'm saying right over here, where we have an asset, let's say, for example, equipment, where its use varies from period to period, units of production would be better than straight line. So when we're calculating depreciation using units of production, what we do is we have to do two steps. The first step, as we can see down here, is to calculate our depreciation expense per unit. And how do I do that? I take my asset cost minus the salvage value divided by the total units of production. So if we were thinking about a truck, I could say, here's the cost of the truck, plus any normal and reasonable expenditures to get it ready for its intended use, minus the salvage value, divided by the total number of miles that I think I'm going to drive the truck. Maybe 100,000 miles. And then what that would give me is depreciation expense per mile, right? So if I have my truck at $11,000, and then a salvage value of $1,000, right? That gives me my depreciable cost of $10,000, and then I think I'm going to drive it $100,000. Well, then what I have is depreciable expense per mile of 10 cents, right? So then what I would do is in step two, I would say, well, okay, it's 10 cents a mile. Depreciation expense is 10 cents a mile. And then this year I drove it 20,000 miles. So then I would multiply 20,000 times 0.1, and then that would be my depreciation expense for that accounting period, for that year. Okay? So let's look at our example here. We're dealing with the same working example where we have our asset cost of 10,000, salvage value of 1,000, accounting period's 5 years, and then this is the number of units inspected. So 36,000 shoes, that corresponds to the total units of production. But then we say over here, assume that 7,000 shoes, right, were actually produced, or 7,000 units were actually produced, and then that we had this following, okay, this same exact depreciation assumptions. So we come over here, we'll say step one, we take the asset cost minus the salvage value. So my asset cost, 10,000, minus my salvage value, divided by my total units of production, is 36,000. And what that gives me is 25 cents per unit. And then step two, it says we produced 7,000 units. 7,000 times my 0.25, which equals my 1,750. Okay? So that would be my depreciation expense. Now my journal entry would be the same. debit depreciation expense, $1,750. What I debit and what I credit is the same across all methods. It's just the dollar amounts that are different. And then credit accumulated depreciation, $1,750. Okay, so that would be my journal entry. Now, if we look over here at our depreciation schedule, depreciation expense depends upon the unit output. So if next year we do 9,000, well, then that would change the depreciation expense, right? Okay, so if we look over here, we can see first year depreciation expense was $1,750. The next year is $2,000, and then look at accumulated depreciation, $1,750 plus the $2,000 after. So after the second year, accumulated depreciation is $3,750. Subtracted from our initial cost gives us our book value after year 2 of $6,250. And then in the third year, I have depreciation expense of $2,250 plus my $3,750 gives me $6,000. Subtracted from my initial asset cost gives me my book value of $4,000. Okay. And then just like before, I don't depreciate below that salvage value. Okay. So I stop at the salvage value. So again, to recap, 2 steps for units of production. First one, calculate the depreciation expense per unit. The second step, multiply that depreciation expense per unit times the number of units during the accounting period, and then that gives you the depreciation expense. The journal entry is the same. Debit depreciation expense, credit accumulated depreciation. Okay? All right. So now let's look at the last method. Remember I said that there were 3. So we did straight line, then we did units of production. Now let's look at double declining. Okay? So with double declining, this is a type of depreciation method that's going to give us very large depreciation expense in the early years of the asset's life. Okay? And then less depreciation later on in the asset's useful life. Okay? So it's an accelerated depreciation method. And the way this works is we have 3 steps. The first step is we compute straight line depreciation rate. So we compute our straight line depreciation rate. Okay. The second step is we double that straight line rate. And then the third step is we compute depreciation by multiplying that double declining rate times the asset's book value at the beginning of the accounting period. Okay. So let's walk through our example to calculate our double declining. So let's assume that we have the following asset costs, salvage value, so on and so forth. Our asset cost, $10,000, salvage value, $9,000, depreciable cost of $9,000, counting periods 5 years, then units inspected, 36,000 shoes. Okay, so we say step 1, calculate the single rate. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm just going to take 100, which stands for 100% of the book value, 100% of the asset cost. Okay, 100% of the initial book value, which is the asset cost, divided by the useful life. So I just take 100% divided by the useful life. And what that gives me is 20%. This is the single line rate. Okay? That's my single line rate. Step 2 is I double that. Well, what's 2 times 20? 40%. Okay? So step 1, just take 100 divided by the useful life. Step 2, double that, and then that's your double rate. Step 3, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. So we'll say year 1, what we do is we take the 10,000, which is the book value at the beginning of year 1. So I'm going to do this journal entry, debit depreciation expense, credit accumulated depreciation at the end of year 1. That's what I'm going to do. So at the beginning of year 1, what is the book value? It's $10,000. So I take my $10,000 times my double rate, which gives me my $4,000. Okay? So at the end of year 1, what I would do is debit depreciation expense, $4,000, credit accumulated depreciation, $4,000. So then at year 2, at the beginning of year 2, what is my book value? Well, remember the way we calculate book value is asset cost minus accumulated depreciation. So at the end of year 1, beginning of year 2, what is accumulated depreciation? It's $4,000. So that means my book value is equal to my $10,000 minus my accumulated depreciation of $4,000. Beginning book value is $6,000 times my 0.4, which gives me my $2,400. Okay, $2,400. So then you can see I'm recognizing a lot of depreciation expense here early in the asset's useful life, and then as you go throughout the asset's useful life, the amount of depreciation expense that I recognize starts to decrease. Okay. All right. So if we look on this next page, this shows us our depreciation schedule. And we do have a wrinkle here with our double declining in our depreciation schedule. So we have our initial book value. Depreciation rate is 40%, gives us our depreciation expense of $4,000. Accumulated depreciation is $4,000. $10,000 cost minus accumulated depreciation gives me the book value of $6,000. And then what I do is $6,000 times 0.4. The second year, $2,400. That means accumulated depreciation is equal to the $2,400 plus the $4,000, $6,400. Book value is $3,600. Okay, and then what I do is I go $3,600. So end of year 2, beginning of year 3, book value is $3,600 times 0.4 gives me depreciation expense of $1,440. $1,440 plus the $6,400 gives me accumulated depreciation of $7,840, and then book value drops to $2,160. Okay. Then I take my $2,160 times 0.4 gives me depreciation expense of $864 plus my $7,840 gives me accumulated depreciation of $8,704, and then I take my book value, my initial asset cost of $10,000 minus my accumulated depreciation of $8,704 gives me my book value of $1,296. Now, if I take $1,296 times 0.4, what that gives me is $518.40. So that's what we would expect if we follow the same process for this last year. That's what we would expect for a depreciation expense on the last year. But look, it's $296. It's not $518.40. It's $296. Why is it $296 and not $518.40? Well, remember, I can't depreciate below the salvage value. So here I'm at $1,296. This is my accumulated, this is my book value. So I can only recognize an additional depreciation expense of $296 because $1,296 minus $296 gets me to my book value of $1,000, which is my salvage value, and I can't have my book value go lower than my salvage value. So when you get towards the end of the accounting period here, you may have to do an adjustment to record this final depreciation expense. And the way that we would do that is we would just simply take this book value minus my salvage value of $1,000 to back in to figure out the depreciation expense for the accounting period, okay? All right, so I'm going to end this lecture video now, and then we will continue where we left off, okay? Thanks so much.